The child hadn't made a sound in 51 days. Not a cry, not a whisper, not even his own name. He sat in the corner of room 9 at Harlow Children's Medical Center with his knees pulled to his chest and his eyes fixed on something outside the window that no one else could see. Every specialist in the building had tried. Every one of them had walked away. The boy was 7 years old, his name was Mateo, and the only person left who refused to give up on him was a quiet, dark-haired nurse named Sora Vance, who was about to be told, in front of the entire ward, that she needed to stop. If this story stays with you, please follow along until the very end. Hit like, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Sora Vance was assigned to room 9, she did something that nobody else had done. She read the intake file. All of it. Not the summary page, not the behavioral flags section that most of the nursing staff flipped to first. She read the original emergency report filed by the paramedics who pulled Mateo out of the creek. She read the police documentation. She read the witness statement from the woman who had been walking her dog along the bank and had seen the car go in. She read the follow-up notes from the 3 therapists who had attempted sessions with him during his first 4 weeks at Harlow and the discharge summaries from each of them, which were written in the careful, neutral language of professionals who had run out of ideas and needed it to sound like a decision rather than a failure. She read all of it sitting at the corner desk of the nurse's station at 6:40 in the morning with a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes earlier. And when she finished, she sat for a moment with her hands flat on the desk. Then she picked up the file, put it back in its slot, and went to find out where room 9 kept its extra chair. Mateo Rios was 7 years old. He had been at Harlow Children's Medical Center for 51 days. He had not spoken in all of them. He had not cried, had not called out, had not responded to his name being called with anything more than the faintest tensing of his jaw. He ate when food was placed near him. He slept when the lights were turned down. When staff entered his room, he went very still, the way a small animal goes still in the presence of something it has not yet decided is safe, and he waited for them to leave. Before the accident, according to the intake profile, Mateo had been described by his kindergarten teacher as talkative, curious, occasionally too loud, obsessed with sea creatures and with the braided friendship bracelets his father made for him on weekends using paracord he brought home from work. His father, Daniel Rios, had been a Navy rescue swimmer before he transitioned out of service. He had been driving when the bridge guardrail gave way on Route 9 outside of Callaway. The car had gone into Shelter Creek at approximately 11:45 in the evening. Daniel had gotten Mateo out through the window, had held him above water until a passing driver stopped and pulled the boy to the bank, had gone under himself in the process, 38 feet from shore, and had not come back up. Mateo had been on the bank for 9 minutes watching the water before anyone thought to cover his eyes. Sora knew about water. She knew what it looked like from certain distances and certain altitudes, and from the inside of a survival suit in a current that wanted you to stop fighting it. She knew what it sounded like when it took things it wasn't supposed to take. She was not going to tell anyone that. Not here. But she remembered it when she read the word creek in the incident report, and the memory sat in her chest like a stone with clean edges, and she breathed around it the way she had learned to breathe around things that couldn't be removed. She walked into room 9 at 7:15. She did not announce herself. She set down the breakfast tray on the small table near the window, not in front of Mateo, not in his space, just nearby, the way you leave something for an animal that needs to decide on its own to come closer. Mateo was in the corner, knees up, eyes on the window. His dark hair needed cutting. There were shadows under his eyes that didn't belong on a 7-year-old's face. Sora pulled the chair from beside the door and set it down roughly 2 feet from the edge of his space. Not close. Close enough. She sat down without looking at him, without the wide, careful smile that most of the staff deployed when they entered his room. A smile that Sora understood was meant to convey safety, but which, to a child who had learned that expressions on adults' faces didn't always match what the adults were about to do, probably read as something requiring analysis. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She looked at the window the same way he did, and after approximately 45 seconds, she began to hum. It was not a song anyone would recognize. It was low and unsteady, almost rhythmic, more like the sound of wind moving through something hollow than any melody a person would choose on purpose. It was the kind of sound that didn't require a response, that didn't imply one was expected. It just existed in the room. Mateo didn't look at her. But the fingers that had been pressed rigid and white against his knees loosened, fractionally, half a degree. Sora saw it. She filed it. She stayed for 22 minutes, then stood, picked up the untouched tray, and left without saying goodbye. 3 hours later, standing at the nurse's station filing post-shift documentation, she was still thinking about those fingers. She did not see Dr. Raymond Voss watching her through the glass wall of his office. Harlow Children's Medical Center occupied the upper 4 floors of a broad building on the north side of Callaway, a mid-sized city that smelled faintly of lake water and salt because it sat 60 miles from the coast and caught the wind off Lake Carver when it blew inland. The pediatric ward on the 4th floor had been repainted 3 years ago in blues and sage greens, ostensibly to feel calming, and the effect was adequate. The hallways had mounted displays of children's artwork that the staff rotated every 6 weeks. The snack cart came around at 2 in the afternoon. These were genuine kindnesses, the kind that accumulate into an environment that is decent without being exceptional. Dr. Raymond Voss ran the pediatric behavioral unit with the particular authority of a man who was good enough at his job that he had stopped needing to question it. He was 54 years old, trim and precise, with the kind of schedule that kept 3 administrative assistants busy and the kind of confidence that filled a room before he opened his mouth. He had published. He had presented. He had a departmental budget that he managed with considerable skill and a waiting list for his program that the hospital used in its annual report as evidence of community trust. He was not, by any objective measure, a bad doctor, but he was the kind of doctor who had learned to mistake fluency for wisdom and who had developed over 2 decades a particular inability to recognize results that didn't come from frameworks he had built himself. He had reviewed Mateo's case 3 weeks into the boy's stay and had concluded, with the efficient certainty of someone accustomed to being right, that the child required pharmacological stabilization, followed by residential behavioral therapy at the Margrave Institute, a specialist facility 4 hours north that had a documented track record with selective mutism in trauma populations. He had initiated the referral process. He had contacted Rosa Rios, Mateo's paternal grandmother and legal guardian, who had legal guardianship following Daniel's death and the ongoing hospitalization of Mateo's mother for her own injuries from the accident. Rosa had declined to sign the transfer paperwork. She had said she needed more time. She had said she needed to see that Harlow had genuinely tried. Voss had interpreted this as the natural resistance of a grieving family member and had decided to give it 3 more weeks before pushing harder. What he had not accounted for was Sora Vance. She had arrived at Harlow 18 months ago with a transfer letter from a hospital in Sacramento and a set of references that were clean and unremarkable enough that the nursing director, Patricia Holm, had spent less than 20 minutes on the interview. Sora had answered every question directly and without decoration. She had not volunteered information beyond what was asked. She had accepted the position, the shift schedule, the locker assignment, and the ward orientation without comment. The other nurses on the 4th floor had formed their impressions over the first few weeks. Competent was the word that came up most often. Private was the second. One nurse, a woman named Felicity, who had been at Harlow for 9 years and considered herself a reliable reader of people, had put it differently during a break-room conversation roughly 2 months into Sora's tenure. "She's not cold," Felicity had said, stirring her soup with excessive focus. "It's not that. It's more like she's operating from a different set of instructions than the rest of us. Like her version of normal has different edges." Nobody had known what to do with that, so they had moved on to complaining about the new charting software. What people noticed, when they paid attention, were small things. The way Sora always took the chair facing the door in the break room. Always. If it was occupied, she stood. The way she had caught a toppling IV pole last November with one hand without turning around, as if she had tracked it in her peripheral vision before the motion was visible to anyone else. The nautical knots. Felicity had noticed those first, the way Sora tied off medical tubing or secured chart pouches with a specificity that went well past hospital training. An orderly named Marcus had noticed that when the building's fire alarm had been tested in October, every nurse on the floor had startled at the initial blast. Sora had already been turning toward the sound a half-second before it reached full volume. Not anticipating. More like she'd felt the system engage before the noise arrived. He had mentioned it once to Felicity, who had nodded slowly and said, "Yeah," in the tone of someone filing something away. There was also the matter of the family in the waiting room in February. A grandfather, large man, exhausted, operating on no sleep and too much grief, had grabbed the arm of a younger nurse named Thomas hard enough to make him cry out. Sora had been on the far end of the hallway. She covered the distance in 4 steps, placed her left hand on the grandfather's forearm with a pressure that was both precise and extraordinarily gentle, and his grip released as if something had simply disengaged. She spoke to the man for 6 minutes without raising her voice. By the end of it, he was in a chair and she had gotten a social worker on the phone. Tomas had found her later in the break room. "What was that?" he'd asked. "That thing with his arm." Sora had poured hot water into a mug and not turned around. "De-escalation technique. It's in the training materials." Tomas had gone looking. He hadn't found it. The day Sora first left something in Mateo's room, it was a river stone, not a piece of medical equipment, not a therapeutic tool logged in any protocol. A smooth, flat stone, gray-green, roughly the size of a child's palm, that she had taken from the jar of desk objects in the staff lounge, the jar where people dropped things they found in their pockets or brought from home for no particular reason. This stone had been there for months. Nobody had claimed it. She placed it on the window ledge of room 9 on a Tuesday morning, without explanation, positioned so that the light hit it and made its color shift from gray to green depending on the angle. Mateo didn't touch it that day. He didn't touch it the next day either. On Thursday morning, Sora came in and the stone had been moved 3 inches to the left. Not knocked. Moved. Precisely, deliberately, to the spot where the morning light hit it strongest. She wrote 2 words in her patient observation log. Voluntary engagement. Under clinical notes, she wrote, "Continue current approach." She told no one. Not because she was hiding it, because she understood that in a building full of people trained to look for large movements, a stone shifted 3 inches in the night was not going to mean what it meant to her, and she didn't have the bandwidth to spend explaining it. On Friday, she brought a second object, an origami crane, folded from a square of blue paper left on the pillow beside him while he was in the bathroom. When she came back an hour later, it had been placed on the window ledge beside the stone. Left side, then stone, then empty space to the right. He was making a line. Sora sat down in her chair and began to hum, and she thought, he's organizing. He's creating order in his space. That wasn't nothing. That was someone who was still building something, still deciding on structure, still treating the world as a place where arrangement mattered. That was someone who had not given up. She didn't smile at him when she left. She didn't tell him he'd done well. She just stood, said quietly, "I'll see you tomorrow, Mateo," and walked out. It was the first time she had used his name directly in his presence. In the hallway, she paused. Behind her, through the door's small window, she could see the back of his head and his shoulders, which were not quite as high as they had been an hour ago. She turned and walked back to the station. The conversation in Voss's office happened on a Wednesday, 3 weeks into Sora's assignment to room 9. The ward was running short that afternoon. 2 nurses out, 1 supply delay on the 3rd floor, a new admission requiring a great deal of documentation. Sora had picked up 2 extra patients without being asked, charted all of it without complaint, and had still managed to get to room 9 at her usual time. She was at the station at 4:15 when Dr. Voss appeared at her elbow and placed a document on the counter in front of her. "Transfer assessment briefing," he said. "Room 9. I need the patient prepared for evaluation this Friday." Sora looked at the document. She didn't pick it up. "Mrs. Rios hasn't signed the transfer authorization. She will once she's seen the formal case summary." Voss paused. His tone shifted into something that was careful and professional and not quite what it appeared to be. "I understand you've been spending significant time with the boy. That's been noted. It reflects well on your commitment to your patients. But what Mateo needs now is a level of clinical intervention that requires specialized—" "He moved a stone," Sora said. Voss blinked. "Voluntarily. 3 times. He repositioned objects in his space with clear intentional geometry. He's making organizational decisions." She kept her voice level and matter-of-fact. His intake file noted his father made him paracord bracelets. "I'd like to try introducing one as a tactile object. There are documented cases in selective mutism populations where familiar material sensory engagement creates—" "Navarro. Vance." He had almost used the wrong name. He caught it, but the stumble was small and telling. Prepare the patient for Friday's evaluation, please. He picked up the document, set it back on the counter, and walked away. Patricia Holm, who had been at the station 3 feet away for the entire exchange, kept her eyes on her computer screen. Felicity at the far end of the station had gone very still. Sora looked at the document for a long moment. Then she picked it up, folded it precisely in thirds, and put it in the pocket of her scrubs beside her small notebook. She didn't throw it away. She didn't sign it. She didn't go to HR. She went back to room 9. That evening, she brought paracord. Not a bracelet. Nothing finished. Nothing that required Mateo to accept a complete object. Just a length of it, dark green, cut to about 12 inches, tied at one end into a figure-8 loop in a configuration that required 2 hands and some deliberate engagement to work loose. A puzzle. Not one labeled as such. Just a knot sitting on the floor between them, placed in the triangle of space she had been maintaining. Stone left, crane right, open space in front. She sat. She hummed. Mateo did not move toward it. She stayed 25 minutes and left. The next morning, the cord was on the window ledge, beside the stone, left side. He had completed the line. Sora photographed it with her phone, not for evidence, for herself. She stood in the doorway of room 9 in the early morning light and looked at the 3 objects arranged in a row. Stone, cord, crane, and she felt something settle in her chest that she didn't have a word for in this building. She'd had a word for it before, in other buildings, in other conditions. It was the word for the moment when you could tell that something that had been retreating had stopped. She texted no one. She just went to get Mateo his breakfast. Rosa Rios came on Saturdays. She was in her late 60s, compact and deliberate in the way she moved, with silver hair braided close to her head and reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck. She brought food every week, something wrapped in foil, something from a kitchen that knew what it was doing. She did not bring loud energy into room 9. She came in and sat near her grandson with the calm of someone who had decided that her presence was the gift, and that requiring anything in return would ruin it. Sora had first spoken with her 3 weeks in, sitting outside room 9 during a break, the door half open. They had not introduced themselves. They had simply begun. "He was in the water," Rosa had said, looking at Mateo, not at Sora. "After the car went in, Daniel got him out. But by the time someone pulled Mateo to the bank, he'd been in the water for, they said 9 minutes, in the cold." Sora had been quiet. "The doctors here want him to talk. They make it sound simple, like he decided to stop and just needs the right encouragement to decide differently." She paused. "He didn't decide. Something just went still, like an animal that learns to be invisible to stay alive." "Yes," Sora had said. Rosa had turned to look at her. "You understand that?" It was not a question. Sora had not answered it either way, but something between them had settled into a different register from that point forward. On the Saturday after Voss's ultimatum, Rosa arrived and found the transfer paperwork waiting at reception. A staff member, acting on standing instructions, had directed her to a consultation room before she reached the ward. 20 minutes later, Rosa sent a message to the nursing station asking for Sora by name. Sora arrived to find Rosa at the table with the documents in front of her, reading glasses on, jaw set. "Friday," Rosa said. "Yes. They're saying there's been no progress." She looked up. "Is that true?" Sora sat down. She didn't bring her own paperwork. She didn't bring a presentation. She reached into her pocket and placed 3 photographs on the table between them, printed that morning on the unit's printer during her break. The first, the window ledge of room 9, stone on the left, cord in the center, crane on the right. The second, Mateo's right hand resting on the cord, fingers open, not gripping, touching. The third, Mateo turned 40 degrees from his default position, facing the light instead of the corner, both cords held loosely in his lap. Rosa looked at them for a long time. She didn't speak. "Self-initiated contact," Sora said quietly. 5 times in the last 8 days. He is making decisions about his space. He is solving small problems. He is not withdrawing. He's not moving fast. But the direction has changed. Rosa took off her reading glasses. "His father made him those bracelets," she said. "Daniel used to do it when Mateo was sick. Mateo would watch him tie the knots and fall asleep to it. She pressed 2 fingers to her mouth briefly. The last thing Mateo did before the accident was ask his father to teach him one. The room was quiet. His father was a rescue swimmer, Rosa continued. Navy, 8 years. He was the one they sent into bad water. She stopped. He got Mateo out. He just couldn't get himself back. Sora looked at the photographs on the table. I need 4 more days, she said. Rosa picked up the transfer authorization. She looked at it for a moment. Then she tore it in half, set both pieces on the table, and folded her hands over them. What happens in 4 days? Sora didn't answer that. She wasn't certain herself, not in the way that could be put into words. She only knew that something was building in room 9, the way pressure builds before weather changes, and that if the room stayed consistent, if the triangle stayed in place, if the cord stayed accessible, if the space kept being what it had been, something was going to give. 4 days, she said again. Rosa nodded once. The crisis began on a Tuesday morning at 6:48. A night shift nurse named Benny arrived to do rounds and opened the door of room 9 and found the bed empty. Not rumpled and moved to the chair, empty. Empty in the particular way that makes a trained healthcare worker's body understand something before the brain finishes the sentence. The sheets were flat. The monitor leads had been disconnected carefully, not torn free, and the 3 objects, stone, cord, crane, had been moved from the window ledge and arranged in a precise row on the floor beside the door, the way someone places things they want found. Benny stood in the doorway for 4 full seconds, which is a long time when you're experienced enough to know what you're looking at. Then he hit the call button. By 6:58, the ward was in controlled emergency mode. By 7:10, Dr. Voss had been reached by phone and had arrived in his street clothes, jacket on over a half-buttoned shirt. He stood at the nurse's station with the particular expression of someone whose institutional certainty had just encountered an event it had not modeled. How does a nonverbal 7-year-old leave a secured pediatric ward without triggering a single alert? Nobody answered. The door sensor on room 9, it emerged, had been malfunctioning for 5 days. A maintenance ticket had been filed. It had not been resolved. The east stairwell camera, the one covering the only exit route that didn't pass directly in front of the nurse's station, had recorded the same 43 seconds of empty hallway on a clean loop. Someone had gotten to the feed. A 7-year-old had not done that. Voss turned to Patricia Holm. Find the boy and find Vance. Now. Sora had arrived at 7:15. She did not go to the nurse's station. She did not stop when Felicity started to call her name. She walked directly to the east stairwell, pushed through the door, and stood for a moment at the landing, perfectly still. Marcus, who had followed her instinctively, watched her tilt her head slightly to the left. What are you doing? She held up one finger. He waited. Not down, she said, and moved up. There's nothing up there, Marcus said, following anyway. Just the maintenance access. There's a landing with a view of the east garden. How do you... She was already moving. The utility door 2 floors up required a key card. The panel beside it showed a green light. The lock was already disengaged. Sora didn't break stride. She pushed the door open and stepped out into the cold. The maintenance landing was a narrow concrete shelf beyond the building's main structure, open to the air, fitted with a safety railing at its edge. The morning was gray-silver, the city below barely awake. Lake Carver was visible on the horizon, a flat dark shape under low cloud. And on the edge of the concrete, legs dangling through the lower bars of the safety railing, both hands wrapped around the uprights, was Mateo. He was looking at the east garden below, at the small rectangle of gravel and dormant plantings that the nursing staff maintained in rotating shifts. He was not crying. He was not distressed in any visible way. He was utterly, completely still. But it was a different stillness than the one Sora had been watching for 51 days. This was not the stillness of retreat. This was the stillness of arrival, like he had come somewhere on purpose and had not yet decided what to do now that he was here. Sora stepped onto the landing. She did not call his name. She did not move fast. She crossed the concrete at exactly the pace she used when she walked into room 9, unhurried, non-threatening, taking up no more space than she needed to. She sat down beside him, a yard of space between them, her own legs over the edge of the concrete, her hands on her knees. She looked at the garden below. She began to hum. Marcus stood in the doorway, not breathing. Behind him, at the bottom of the stairwell, he could hear voices. Voss, Patricia, the crackle of a radio. Sora reached into her scrub pocket without looking and produced the first chord. The original. The one Mateo had first moved, first touched, first turned in his hands, alone in the dark. She held it out to the side, not toward him, not offering, just placing it in the space between them, the way she always placed things in the triangle. Mateo looked at it. Voss appeared in the doorway behind Marcus. He took in the scene, Mateo at the railing, Sora beside him, and drew a sharp breath. We need to get him away from the edge. Now. I'll call... Marcus turned and held up his hand. A floor-level orderly holding up his hand to stop a department chief was not something that happened in this building. Voss stared. Marcus kept his hand up, eyes steady, until Voss went still. On the landing, Sora had shifted 6 inches closer. Not sudden, not reaching. She placed the cord on the concrete between them and then put her own hand beside it, palm up, open, not asking, not reaching, just there. Mateo looked at her hand, he looked at the cord, he looked at the garden, and then, in a voice that barely had enough substance to be called a voice, cracked from months of disuse, barely a frequency above breath, Mateo said 3 words. Voss couldn't hear them from the doorway. Marcus closed his eyes, because he could hear them. Standing 6 feet back, in the cold gray morning air of a hospital maintenance landing in Callaway, he could hear exactly what the boy had said to the quiet, dark-haired nurse beside him, and the words hit him somewhere he hadn't expected, somewhere he didn't know was still open. Sora turned her head slowly. She looked at Mateo. She said just as quietly, I know. She held out her hand. He took it. She rose carefully, and she lifted him from the railing with both arms, the way you lift a child who has been somewhere difficult and is only now finding the edge of being done with it, and she held him against her chest, and he did not pull away, and she did not say anything, and for a long moment the only sound was the wind coming off Lake Carver, and one small pair of hands gripping the shoulders of a nurse's scrubs, like they intended to stay there for a while. Behind her, in the doorway of the maintenance landing, Dr. Raymond Voss stood with his transfer paperwork hanging from one hand and his mouth slightly open, and something he had been very certain about 3 hours ago, becoming considerably less certain by the second. He would understand it fully in 36 hours. Right now, all he understood was what he could see, and what he could see had already changed everything. They brought Mateo back to room 9 at 7:43. Sora carried him the last stretch of hallway because his legs had decided they were done, the way a child's legs sometimes decide independently of anything the child intends. And she walked with him like that, his face against her shoulder, past the nurse's station where Felicity and Tomas had gone very quiet, past the cart of breakfast trays that nobody was delivering yet, past the closed door of Voss's office where the blinds were angled but not quite shut. She set him down on the bed gently. He didn't let go of her scrub top immediately. She waited. She didn't pull away or look at her watch or say anything about needing to go. She just waited until his fingers loosened on their own, which took approximately 40 seconds. And then she reached across and pulled the blanket up over his legs. She placed the cord on the bed beside him. Not in his hand. Beside him. Then she pulled the chair close, not the 2 feet of careful distance she had been maintaining for weeks, closer, within arm's reach, and she sat down. She did not hum this time. She just sat. Mateo's eyes drifted to the window, but after a minute they came back to her, and they stayed. She noticed the exact moment because she had been waiting for it since day one, not for him to look at her, but for his eyes to land on her the way eyes land on something they've decided is part of their landscape. Not a stranger, a known thing. She let herself breathe. In the hallway, the ward was coming back to operational. She could hear Patricia's voice on the phone, even and controlled. She could hear the breakfast cart finally starting its rounds. She could hear, distantly, Voss's door close. She stayed in room 9 for another hour and 20 minutes. When she left, Mateo was asleep with one hand resting open on the cord. What happened in the next 6 hours happened in the way that difficult institutional things usually happen. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in a series of small pressures applied from multiple directions until something had to give. Voss called a case meeting at 11. He did not invite Sora. He invited Patricia, the ward's consulting psychiatrist Dr. Nadia Ferrante, and the charge nurse for the 3rd floor, a woman named Gwen, who had no direct involvement with Room 9, but whose administrative seniority Voss occasionally used as ballast in these conversations. Sora was in the middle of a medication round when Felicity found her and told her, keeping her voice low and her expression carefully neutral, that the meeting was happening in Voss's office. Right now. Sora looked at the medication cart. She finished the round. Then she walked to the nurse's station, wrote up the documentation, washed her hands, and went to the break room and poured herself a cup of coffee that she knew was going to be terrible because it was the 11 o'clock pot and nobody had made fresh since 8. She drank it standing at the window, looking at the parking structure across the street, and she thought about what Mateo's hands had looked like this morning when he had finally let go of the railing and taken hers instead. And she thought about the weight of him against her shoulder in the hallway. And she thought about a lot of things she was not going to think about in front of anyone in this building. She had been doing that for a long time. Compartmentalizing was probably the clinical word for it. She had other words, more accurate ones. But this wasn't the place. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. She knew because she was still in the break room, or within earshot of it, and she watched the clock without appearing to. When it ended and the door opened, she was back at the nurse's station before Voss emerged. She was charting. She looked like she had been charting for the past hour. He came to the station. He didn't make her wait. The incident this morning represents a significant patient safety failure, he said. I've reviewed the overnight logs and the maintenance records. There will be a formal review process. I understand. I want to be clear that this review is not targeted at any individual at this stage. He paused. However, I also want to be clear that the protocol deviation regarding Mateo Rios's therapeutic approach, the non-logged interventions, the unsanctioned objects, those are going to be part of that review. Sora looked at him. The interventions worked. A child climbed to an unsecured maintenance landing at 7 in the morning. That is not a metric I'm prepared to file under interventions working. He came back, she said. He didn't have to. He knew where the door was. He knew how to get out. He went somewhere high and open, somewhere with a view of water, and he sat there and he waited. She paused. He was waiting for someone to come and not panic. The station was quiet. Tomas at the far end had gone still. He chose to come back, Sora said. That's not a safety failure. That's the first decision he's made in 51 days. Voss looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes that she couldn't read and he wasn't sharing. Then he said, I'll need your incident report by end of shift. Full documentation of every non-protocol intervention from day 1. He walked away. Sora picked up her pen and went back to the chart in front of her, and Tomas, at the far end of the station, let out a breath so carefully it was almost inaudible. Almost. She wrote the incident report, all of it, every object, every date, every repositioning, the stone, the crane, the cords, the spatial arrangement, the photographs. Marcus, she corrected herself, he went by Marcus here, had taken at her informal request over the past 2 weeks, which she attached as documentation with timestamps. She wrote what she had observed about Mateo's behavioral progression in clinical language that was precise and detailed and referenced 3 published papers on sensory-based intervention in pediatric trauma mutism that she had read during her rehabilitation years, and that nobody at Harlow would think to look for because they weren't in any of Voss's syllabi. She wrote the incident report and she submitted it at 4:58, 2 minutes before end of shift. She printed a copy and kept it. Then she went back to room 9 for the last time that day. Mateo was awake. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, not in the corner, on the edge, the cord in both hands, working at the knot she had tied that morning. His fingers were clumsy with it. The tongue to lower lip concentration face was back, that intensely ordinary expression of a child wrestling with something mildly difficult, the kind of face kids make over shoelaces and jar lids and homework problems. Sora sat down. She watched him work the knot for a while without saying anything. He got it part way, and then it cinched in the wrong direction, and he made a small, frustrated sound. Not a word, but a sound. The kind of involuntary noise that comes from a body that has stopped remembering it's supposed to be silent. She leaned forward. Try the left loop first, she said. The right side is a false lead. He looked at her. He looked at the cord. He tried the left loop. The knot came apart. He looked at it in his hands, the two loose ends, the solved problem, and then he looked at her again with an expression that was not quite a smile but was made of the same material. "Good," she said. "Just that." She stood to leave. At the door she paused, not looking back. "Same time tomorrow," she said. "I'll bring a harder one." She didn't hear a response. She hadn't expected one. But she was 2 steps into the hallway when she heard, just barely, the sound of the cord being picked up again from the bed. The small, specific sound of a child who has found something worth continuing with. She kept walking. She did not let her face do what it wanted to do until she was around the corner. Rosa called that evening. Not the hospital line. Sora's personal cell, which Rosa had gotten from the unit's family contact sheet, and which Sora, when she saw the number, answered immediately. "They sent me another document," Rosa said. Her voice was steady in the way that takes effort to maintain. "A revised transfer brief, Voss's office, hand-delivered to my building this afternoon." Sora was standing in her apartment kitchen, still in her scrubs. "What does it say?" "That the morning incident demonstrates Mateo's need for a more controlled therapeutic environment. That Harlow's current care structure is insufficient." A pause. "That they're requesting emergency guardianship review to expedite the transfer given the safety event." Sora set down the glass she was holding. Emergency guardianship review was a different level of process. That was not a transfer form. That was a legal mechanism. That was Voss deciding that Rosa's refusal to sign had become an obstacle he was going to go around rather than through. "When?" Sora asked. "They filed for a hearing. Thursday." Today was Tuesday. That was 36 hours. Rosa's voice was carefully controlled when she spoke again. "I know you said 4 days. We don't have 4 days anymore." Sora stood for a moment in her kitchen with the refrigerator humming in the background and the evening light going gray through the window. "I know," she said. There was a silence. Then Rosa said quietly, "My son used to say that the most dangerous moment in a rescue operation isn't when the situation is at its worst. It's when the people running the operation decide they already know the outcome." Sora didn't answer that, but she thought about it for a long time after they hung up. She was back at Harlow by 5:45 the next morning. Not because her shift started then. It didn't start until 7. She came early because she needed to think in the building, and because thinking in the building sometimes required being there when the night shift was winding down and the day shift hadn't yet arrived, and the ward existed in a briefly honest state before the institutional performance of the day got underway. She went to room 9 first. Mateo was asleep. The cord was on the pillow beside his face, his hand resting near it, but not gripping. She stood in the doorway for a moment and then stepped back and let the door close quietly. She went to the nurse's station and sat down at one of the back terminals and began pulling research. Not Mateo's file. She knew that by memory now. She pulled the published literature on selective mutism and trauma-based dissociation in children under 10. She pulled 3 papers she had cited in her incident report and 2 more that she hadn't. She cross-referenced the behavioral observations she had logged over the past 4 weeks with documented progression patterns in comparable cases. She built something. Not a presentation, not a report exactly. More like a case made in the language that the building understood, with timestamps and citations and outcome data that said, this is what is actually happening, and it is not what you think. Marcus arrived at 6:30 and found her at the terminal. He looked at the screen, then at her. "What are you building?" he asked. "Documentation." "For the hearing?" She looked at him. "I heard Felicity and Tomas talking," he said. "Thursday." He pulled up a chair without being invited. "What do you need?" She looked at him for a moment. I was 26, sharp-eyed, had been at Harlow for 4 years, and had been paying close attention to things for approximately as long. She had noticed that about him early on. "The photographs you took," she said, "all of them, not just the 3 I used with Rosa, everyone." He reached for his phone. "I've got 14. She looked at that. 14. He had been documenting without being asked over 2 weeks without telling her. She considered saying something about that. Then she decided it was more useful to simply proceed. "Send them to the secure unit email," she said. "I'll add them to the file." He nodded. Then, "There's something else." She waited. "The camera feed," he said. "The east stairwell, the loop." "Yes." "That's not something a maintenance error does. That's a configured interference." He kept his voice quiet and even. I used to work AV installation before this. Someone accessed that feed remotely and ran a static loop over a 43-second window. That's not something you do by accident, and it's not something a 7-year-old does. Sora looked at him. Mateo got out on his own, she said carefully. I know. The door sensor was genuinely broken. He found it, tested it, went through. But someone else knew he might go. Someone made sure nobody would see him on that camera long enough for him to get to the roof safely. A pause. That's not hospital staff. Sora said nothing. That's someone with remote access capability and a reason to want Mateo to get somewhere visible without being intercepted. The ward was still quiet. The night nurse at the far end of the station was doing her final chart entries and not paying attention to this conversation. Marcus looked at Sora steadily. I'm not going to ask you to explain it, he said. I'm just telling you what I found. She held his gaze for a moment. What did you find when you looked up the loop timestamp? 6:41 started 6:41, ran until 7:24. She'd arrived at 7:15. She had gone directly to the east stairwell. So someone bought you time, Marcus said. Not a question. Sora turned back to the screen. File the technical report with maintenance, she said. Not security, maintenance. Reference the door sensor fault and request a full system audit for that corridor, she paused. Make it administrative. Don't make it sound like an investigation. He was quiet for a moment, then, okay. He went to his own terminal. She went back to her documentation. But her hands, for a moment, were not quite steady over the keys, and she noticed that, and she made them steady again, and she kept working. Well, the formal review meeting was held at 2 o'clock. Voss had added 2 people she hadn't expected, the hospital's patient safety officer, a methodical woman named Dr. Constance Pryor, and the head of legal affairs whose name was Gerald Sitch, and who had the look of a man who had attended a great many uncomfortable meetings and had learned to be comfortable in them. Sora sat on one side of the table, Patricia sat beside her, which Sora noted, because Patricia could have positioned herself anywhere and had chosen to sit next to the nurse under review rather than the department chief who had called the meeting. Voss presented the case summary. He was precise and not unfair in his framing, which was, Sora recognized, its own kind of danger. The facts as he presented them were largely accurate. The interpretation was another matter. The patient showed no measurable progress under conventional protocol, he said. The assigned nurse implemented a series of non-sanctioned interventions without logging, without supervisor approval, and without evidence base. The result was a patient safety incident in which a pediatric patient with severe trauma-related behavioral disorder accessed an unsecured area of the building. He paused. We are additionally facing a guardianship review proceeding on Thursday, in which the family may challenge the transfer recommendation partly on the basis of representations made by this nurse to the guardian. Dr. Pryor looked at Sora. Do you want to respond? Sora had her documentation folder on the table in front of her. She didn't open it yet. The patient showed measurable progress, she said. I logged it. The logs are in the system. What wasn't entered under the formal therapy rubric was entered under clinical observation notes, which are also a part of the medical record. She paused. Would you like me to walk through them chronologically? Pryor looked at Voss. He nodded, with the expression of someone who was not expecting this to take long. Sora opened the folder. It took 40 minutes. She walked through every date, every object, every behavioral shift, every citation. She cross-referenced Mateo's documented trauma responses with published literature in 3 languages. One of them translated because the most relevant paper was a Norwegian clinical study from 2019 that had not been adapted for American audiences, and which she had translated herself during her rehabilitation. She was not dramatic about any of it. She was plain and methodical and relentlessly specific. When she finished, the room was quiet. Sitch, the legal officer, was looking at the folder. You translated a Norwegian research paper, he said. The findings were directly applicable. A silence. The patient spoke this morning, Sora said. Not a word. 3 words. And this afternoon he voluntarily worked a complex knot pattern for 40 minutes. His occupational engagement index, she referenced the specific measure, has increased by 63% in 7 days by the ward's own recorded metrics. She looked at Voss directly. He is not failing to progress. He is progressing on a timeline appropriate to the severity of his trauma. What would transfer to the Margrave Institute do to a child in this specific stage of re-engagement? Voss said nothing. The literature on disruption of early-stage selective mutism breakthrough is clear, she said. 18 to 24 months of regression following environmental change at this phase. That is not a clinical opinion. That is what the data says. Dr. Pryor was taking notes now. Sitch cleared his throat. The guardianship review on Thursday will go differently if this room decides in the next hour to document what has actually been occurring with this patient, Sora said. Mrs. Rios has not been obstructing care. She has been asking for accurate information. She deserves to have it before a court asks her to respond to a petition she didn't initiate. Silence again. Voss had not spoken for 12 minutes. That was the longest she had ever seen him go without speaking in a professional setting. She watched him looking at the folder on the table between them, and she watched him doing something that was visibly difficult for him, which was recalculating. She did not feel triumphant. She felt tired in a way that went below the current shift and below the past 3 weeks and down into somewhere much older. She had done this before in other rooms, made cases with other kinds of documentation, held other lines. She was very good at it. She wished, not for the first time, that being good at it felt better. Pryor looked up from her notes. I'd like to review the full observation log before making any recommendation, she said. And I'd like to request a formal behavioral assessment of Mateo Rios by an independent pediatric trauma specialist before the Thursday proceeding. Voss looked at her. That's within my authority as patient safety officer, she said pleasantly. It was. It would also delay the hearing. Voss said after a moment, Fine. Sitch was already typing on his phone. Sora looked down at her folder and then closed it. She didn't say anything else. Patricia, beside her, had not spoken once during the entire meeting. But when they stood to leave, she put her hand briefly on Sora's arm, one small, firm pressure, there and then gone, and walked out ahead of her. It was almost 6 in the evening before things quieted enough for Sora to go back to room 9. She was later than usual. Mateo was sitting on the edge of the bed. The cord was in his lap. He had been waiting. She could see it in the way he was positioned, oriented toward the door, not the window. She sat down. She reached into her pocket and produced a new cord, longer than the others, a deep navy blue. I said I'd bring a harder one, she said. She began to tie. It was a more complex sequence, 3 separate interlocking loops with a sliding tension component that required following a specific order, or it collapsed into a tangle. She went slowly. She let him see each step. He watched her hands with the same absolute focus he'd given the garden from the maintenance landing, the total, unblinking attention of someone trying to understand a language they almost recognize. She finished. She held it up. He reached for it immediately. Both hands. The tongue-to-lip face arrived within 4 seconds. She watched him try the first loop. He went right. It cinched. He made the same small sound of frustration as yesterday. Left, she said. He switched. It gave. He kept going. At the 3rd loop, he hit a sequence problem she hadn't warned him about. The cord twisted in a direction that looked like progress but wasn't. He worked at it for 2 full minutes, getting increasingly stuck, before he stopped and looked at her with an expression that was completely readable. I'm lost. She leaned forward and pointed without touching the cord. You passed a step, she said. The middle loop. Go back. He looked at it. He found the missed step. He went back. He got it wrong again. He let out a frustrated breath through his nose, sharp and very human, and then he set the cord down in his lap and looked at the ceiling for 3 seconds exactly, the way adults do when they're trying not to lose patience with themselves. Sora pressed her lips together to keep her face neutral. He picked the cord back up. He tried again. He got it. The whole structure released in a smooth cascade, and he sat there for a moment with the unknotted cord in both hands and the expression of someone who has been somewhere difficult and come out the other side of it. He looked at her. She looked back. Again? She asked. He held out the cord. She took it. She was 2 loops into tying it when her phone, on silent in her pocket, buzzed with a pattern she had assigned to one specific contact. Not the hospital system, not a patient family. One specific person. She finished the 3rd loop before she looked at it. The message was 3 words. On my way. She looked at it for 1 moment, then put her phone away, and handed Mateo the finished knot, and for a few seconds she could not quite make her breathing do what she wanted, because the only person who had that number and would send those 3 words was someone she had not spoken to in 14 months, And the only reason he would be coming here, coming to Callaway, to this building, was because someone had told him something she had been very careful not to tell anyone. She knew who had made that call. She knew before she finished the thought. Rosa. And she didn't know, sitting in room 9 with a 7-year-old unknotting paracord in the yellow light of a Wednesday evening, whether the person walking toward this hospital right now was going to save the situation or blow it apart entirely. Mateo got the knot undone on the 3rd attempt. He held the loose cord in both hands and looked at it the way a person looks at something they've just figured out. Not proud exactly, more like satisfied, the way satisfaction feels before you've learned to perform it for other people. He set it down on the bed beside him and looked at the window. Then he looked back at Sora. She was still holding her phone in her lap, face down. She turned it over once, screen down again, put it in her pocket. Whatever was coming could come. She had until morning to think about it, which meant she had until morning to decide how to feel, which meant right now she was going to do what she was here to do. "Want to try it again?" she asked. He picked up the cord. She tied the knot a second time, slightly faster, slightly less narrated, letting him watch without being walked through it. This time he found the left loop on the first attempt. He lost the sequence at the same third loop problem. He set the cord down, looked at the ceiling, picked it back up, did not ask for help. He got it on his own. Sora said nothing. She did not applaud. She did not tell him she was proud of him or that he'd done great. She just looked at him with the same even, present expression she had brought to this room every day for 4 weeks. And he looked back at her, and something in the exchange was so ordinary it almost broke her open. She left at 7:15. She said the same thing she always said, "Same time tomorrow." In the hallway she stopped, back against the wall beside his door, and let herself close her eyes for exactly 5 seconds. Not long enough for anyone passing to read as distress. Long enough to be a person for a moment before becoming a professional again. Then she walked out. Gut. She did not sleep well. This was not unusual. She had not slept well with any regularity since her second deployment, and she had made a practical arrangement with her own insomnia years ago. When sleep didn't come, she read. When reading didn't settle her, she worked. When work didn't exhaust her enough, she ran. She ran 6 miles that night at 10:15 through the streets of Callaway's east side, where the lake wind came through the gaps between buildings cold enough to make her lungs work for it, and she thought about the message on her phone. 3 words. On my way. She thought about the only person who would send it and what it meant that he was sending it from wherever he was, at whatever hour he'd sent it, having apparently received a phone call from a 70-year-old woman in Callaway who had somehow found his number through a chain of connections that spoke to a particular kind of network, one that did not advertise itself and did not need to. She thought about what it would mean for this building when he arrived. She thought about what it would mean for her. She finished the 6 miles and walked the last 2 blocks to her building and stood in the shower until the water ran cold, and then she sat on the edge of her bed with her hair damp and her phone on the nightstand, and she did not look at it, and eventually she slept for 4 hours, which was more than she had expected. Thursday arrived with the particular gray light that Callaway produced in November, flat and without temperature, the kind of sky that made the lake look like hammered tin. Sora was at Harlow by 6:30. She went to room 9. Mateo was awake, sitting up, cord already in his hands. He was working on it without prompting, not the knot she had tied, she hadn't left one, but a configuration of his own, something simple, a loop and tuck that she recognized as a child's version of a structure his father had probably showed him once. She stood in the doorway without speaking. He looked up. He held it out toward her, not offering, showing. "You did that yourself," she said. He pulled it back to his lap, not defensive, more like he was returning it to where it belonged, to him. His. She sat down. She didn't bring a new cord. She just sat with him while he worked, and for 20 minutes the room was quiet and functional and not unhappy, and she thought, if you saw this and didn't know what it had taken to get here, it would look like nothing. Just a nurse sitting with a kid. Nothing at all. The hearing was scheduled for 2 o'clock. She had 3 hours before her shift ended at 1. She intended to be present when it happened, not inside the proceedings. Family law hearings didn't work that way, and she was not a party to it, but present in the building, available if Rosa needed her. What she had not planned for was what happened at 8:47. It started at the nurses' station, which was where most things at Harlow started, the same way most weather starts over water. A convergence of conditions that looks like nothing until it doesn't. Marcus came in from the corridor with an expression she had learned to read over the past 3 weeks. The expression of someone who has found something and is not sure what to do with it yet. He waited until the 2 other nurses at the station had moved to handle a supply question, then stepped up beside her. "The camera audit," he said, keeping his voice below conversational. She kept her eyes on the chart she was annotating. "What about it?" "Maintenance ran it last night. Full system audit. Eastern, the way I filed it." He set a printed page on the counter beside her hand without looking at it. The loop on the stairwell camera wasn't the only one. She looked at the page. It was a system log excerpt, time-stamped. There were 3 separate camera feed interventions over the past 6 days. The stairwell loop, Tuesday morning. A 40-second gap in the lobby feed on Saturday afternoon. The afternoon Rosa had arrived and been redirected to the consultation room before reaching the ward. And a 17-second interruption in the feed covering the door to Voss's office on Monday at 3:12 p.m., the time of Voss's case meeting, the one she hadn't been invited to. Sora looked at the log for a moment without picking it up. "Who filed this?" she asked. "Maintenance, as an administrative audit. Like you said." He paused. "But Pryor is going to see it. The patient safety review pulls all system logs for the relevant period automatically. She'll have it by 11. Sora considered that. Someone had been in this system multiple times, deliberately, with specific timing, each intervention corresponding to a moment when it was useful that visibility was limited. The stairwell coverage to protect Mateo's exit. The lobby feed to... She turned that over, trying to understand it. Saturday afternoon. Rosa arriving. Rosa being redirected before she reached the ward. Someone had watched Rosa being redirected and ensured there was no recording of who was in the lobby at that moment. She thought about what kind of person did that. What kind of person had the access, the skill, the reason. She thought about the message on her phone. "On my way." Not, "I heard about the case." Not, "Call me when you can." 3 words that assumed she already knew why. That assumed she had enough context to understand the arrival as a response to something specific. He had been watching this. Not just receiving Rosa's phone call, he had been watching it before that. She put the log page face down on the counter. "Put that in the administrative file," she said. "Patient safety review. Don't draw attention to it. Just make sure it's in the record." Marcus picked it up. He didn't ask any more questions. She went back to her chart. Her handwriting was level. That was the part she had always been able to control, the part that stayed even when other things didn't. She had written field notes in conditions that would have made most people's hands shake, and the writing had been readable. Clean lines were a discipline, not a talent. You decided to do it, and then you did it. She decided and did it and kept going. Well, at 9:55, the call came from reception that a visitor had arrived, asking for Sora Vance by name. Felicity took the call. She looked up from the receiver with an expression that was carefully, deliberately composed, which meant it was not composed at all. The desk says it's a Navy Admiral," she said. "Retired. He's in the lobby." The station went briefly, completely quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when everyone in a room simultaneously decides not to react until they understand what they're reacting to. Sora was already standing. She put the chart down. She didn't say anything. "Sora." Felicity said it like a question. "I'll go down," Sora said. Simple, declarative. She walked to the elevator. She pressed the lobby button and stood with her hands at her sides and watched the floor indicator drop and did not think about what her face was doing. The lobby of Harlow Children's Medical Center was not large. It had a reception desk, a waiting area with upholstered chairs in the ward's sage green, a small corner display of children's drawings updated monthly by the volunteer program. It smelled like floor cleaner and the coffee cart near the entrance that was already out of the dark roast. I was standing near the window. Civilian clothes, dark trousers, a gray wool sweater, a heavy jacket with no insignia. He was in his early 70s, silver-haired, broad through the shoulders, in the way that some men retain regardless of age when they've spent enough years building it. His posture was the kind that doesn't come from habit or intention, but from years of it becoming structural, load-bearing in the body, the same way a beam is load-bearing in a wall. He turned when she came off the elevator. She stopped. Something moved across her face that was fast enough that nobody watching could have named it. Then she crossed the lobby. Thomas, she said. Sora. He said her name the way people say the names of people they have said across radios in bad conditions and are relieved to say to their face. He did not move to shake her hand. He looked at her. You look tired, he said. I'm fine. I know you're fine. You look tired. He said it like they were two different things, because they were. She glanced toward the reception desk. The woman there was trying very hard to appear occupied. We shouldn't do this here. No, he agreed. Is there somewhere? She took him to the consultation room on the second floor. It was unused at this hour. She closed the door. She didn't sit. She stood with her back to the wall beside the door and looked at him across the room. Rosa called you, she said. She did. How did she get your number? Her son served, he said. Daniel Rios. I didn't know him directly, but his commanding officer does. 3 phone calls. He paused. She's resourceful. She is. Sora looked at the table. The camera feeds. He waited. 3 separate interventions. Stairwell, lobby, outside Voss's office. She looked up. That was you. He didn't answer immediately, which was, itself, an answer. That's a significant exposure, she said. Her voice was even, not angry, not grateful, processing. If that audit surfaces something traceable, it won't. Thomas. Sora. He said it the same way she had said his name. Not a dismissal, a reassurance delivered in the fewest possible syllables by someone who did not make promises they couldn't keep. It won't. She breathed through that. She knew he was right. She also knew what it had cost in terms of resources and discretion and the particular currency of favors that people in his position spent carefully and did not recoup. You didn't have to come here, she said. Rosa told me what they were trying to do with the hearing. He sat down at the consultation table, one hand flat on the surface. He was not young. He moved with the careful intention of someone who had stopped taking his body for granted. A guardianship petition to override an objecting family member in a pediatric behavioral case where the primary evidence is a safety incident that your own documentation contradicts. He paused. I've watched you work for 11 years, Sora. I have specific knowledge of what you are capable of. I was not going to let someone file that hearing without making sure there was someone in this building who could say so with the appropriate weight. She looked at him. What are you going to say? She asked. The truth. He said it simply. What it was like to work with you, what I have records showing you achieved, what the Institutional Review Board of the Navy's Medical Corps documented about your outcomes with pediatric trauma cases in field conditions. He met her eyes. I'm going to say it to whoever needs to hear it, at whatever volume makes it land. The room was very quiet. They'll ask why I'm here, she said. Why now? Why a retired admiral is showing up at a children's hospital in Callaway for a family court hearing. Yes, and you'll tell them. Only what you want told. She looked at the table for a moment. The wood grain. The water ring from someone's coffee cup that the cleaning staff had missed. The small details of a room that was otherwise unremarkable. In a building that was otherwise unremarkable, where a 7-year-old boy had said 3 words to her on a concrete landing, and she had said, I know, because she did know. She had always known, and the knowing was the thing she had never found a way to explain to anyone who hadn't been in the kind of water that doesn't let you explain it afterward. Tell them what you need to, she said. He nodded once. She pushed off from the wall. The hearing's at 2. Patient safety officer is named Pryor. She's the one who matters. Voss is entrenched. Legal's name is Sitch. She paused with her hand on the door. There's a nurse on the 4th floor, Tomas, and an orderly named Marcus. They've been watching and they've been documenting without being asked to. If it comes to witness statements, they'll give them. Hargrove looked at her. They know who you are? No. But they showed up anyway. She considered that. Yes. He said nothing, but his expression did something brief and unguarded that she hadn't seen from him in a long time. Something like recognition. She opened the door. The ward found out in pieces, the way it always did. Felicity to Tomas. Tomas to Marcus. Marcus to Patricia, who was at the nurse's station annotating supply orders, and went very still when she heard the word Admiral, and then stood up and went to the window that faced the lobby and stood there long enough to see the man herself, now moving through the ground floor hallway with Sora beside him. By noon, the fourth floor had achieved a particular quality of tension that was not quite performed and not quite organic. The tension of people who have information they don't fully understand and are watching the clock move toward 2 o'clock with the awareness that whatever was going to happen soon. Voss arrived at 11:30 from a morning off-site. He was briefed by Patricia in the hallway outside his office, and whatever she told him, whatever she judged necessary to include, the result was that he came to the station 12 minutes later and asked to speak with Sora. She was in room 9. He came to the door. He did not come in. He stood in the doorway with his jacket on and his expression doing the difficult work of someone revising a position they've held long enough to have made structural. Matteo was on the bed, cord in his lap, not paying attention to any of this. "There's someone downstairs," Voss said. "I know. He asked for you." "I know." Voss looked past her at Matteo, at the cord, at the way Matteo's shoulders weren't pressed to his ears the way they'd been 4 weeks ago when anyone opened this door. He looked for a moment with an expression that she couldn't read fully. Not quite shame, not quite concession. Something in between that hadn't resolved into either yet. "Is there anything I should know before 2 o'clock?" he asked. Sora considered the question. "He's here to speak to the competency of my approach," she said. "If you're asking whether this is going to be adversarial, that depends on whether the hospital decides to continue with the guardianship petition." Silence. "The patient safety report," Voss said. "Prior's review." "It documents outcomes," Sora said. "They support continuing current care." He looked at Matteo again. A long moment. Then, "I'll speak to legal before 2. He left. Sora turned back to room 9. Matteo had looked up during the conversation. He was watching her now with the specific focus of a child who is reading a situation through adult behavior the way children do when they've learned that adult behavior is usually the most reliable indicator of what's about to happen. She sat back down. She reached into her pocket and produced the Navy cord, re-knotted. "Go ahead," she said. He took it. He found the left loop without prompting. "What?" At 1:47, 13 minutes before the hearing, something happened that nobody had anticipated. Not because it was unpredictable in retrospect, because it was the kind of thing that becomes predictable only once you understand the full shape of what's been happening, and most of the people in the building did not yet have the full shape. Sora was at the nurse's station, logging her end-of-shift documentation. Her shift had ended at 1, but she was still there, and no one had told her to leave, and she had not offered to go. Marcus appeared at her elbow. He had been on the floor below on a routine transfer and had come back up with a particular expression, the one that meant he had intercepted something. "There's a woman in the lobby," he said quietly. "She's been there since noon. She's not a family member. She's not listed on any patient contact sheet." He set a piece of paper on the counter. She asked the desk twice whether the hearing had been postponed. She had a copy of the petition. Sora looked at the paper. It was Marcus's handwriting, a description, 50s, business clothes, laptop bag, no visitor badge, sitting near the west entrance. A copy of the petition, which was a sealed court document not available to the general public. "She didn't give a name?" Sora asked. "Said she was a consultant for the Margrave Institute." Sora was still for a moment. The Margrave Institute. The facility 4 hours north where Voss had been trying to transfer Matteo. The facility that stood to receive a patient, and the associated funding, insurance billing, and program enrollment figures that came with a court-ordered pediatric placement. A consultant from the receiving facility, with a copy of a sealed petition, in the lobby of the referring hospital 2 hours before a hearing that the referring physician had initiated. "Where's Pryor?" Sora asked. "Her office, 2nd floor." Sora looked at her documentation. She put down her pen. She was in Pryor's office in 4 minutes. Pryor looked up from a stack of files, the patient safety review materials. Sora could see her own incident report in the pile, and started to speak. Sora told her about the woman in the lobby in 31 words. Clean, sequential, no interpretation offered, just the facts. Pryor was silent for 3 seconds. Then she reached for her phone. But the hearing, at 2 o'clock, did not proceed as scheduled. Sitch, the legal officer, requested a 30-minute delay at 1:58, citing a procedural review. The family court liaison, a patient woman named Miss Ortega, who had driven 40 minutes for this, agreed with visible restraint and sat in the waiting area with her briefcase. Rosa arrived at 1:55 and found Sora in the second-floor hallway. She looked at Sora. "What's happening?" "A complication," Sora said, "but it's being handled." Rosa looked at her steadily. "Is Mateo all right?" "He tied a new knot this morning," Sora said. "His own configuration. He designed it himself." Something moved through Rosa's face, fast and unguarded and completely human. She pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way people look at ceilings when they are refusing to cry in a hallway. "Thomas Hargrove is in the building," Sora said. "He's going to speak." Rosa looked at her. "I hope it was all right to call him." "Yes," Sora said. It came out without hesitation, which surprised her slightly. But it was true. She had not known until it came out of her mouth that it was true, and now she did. The 30 minutes stretched to 45. During that time, 3 things happened in sequence. First, Pryor's security review identified the woman in the lobby as a contract acquisition consultant for the Margrave Institute, who had been in communication with a member of Harlow's administrative board, not medical staff administrative board, regarding the Rio's transfer case, including a preliminary billing projection for a 2-year residential placement that had been drafted before the guardianship petition was filed, before the safety incident, before the transfer recommendation had been formally communicated to the family. Second, Sitch, upon being informed of this, made 2 phone calls in rapid succession, the second of which lasted 9 minutes and resulted in him appearing in the hallway outside the consultation room with the expression of a man who had just recalibrated his own professional exposure and was doing it under time pressure. Third, Hargrove was asked to give a voluntary statement for the record by Miss Ortega, the court liaison, who had been given a brief summary by Pryor and had exercised her own judgment about how to use the available time. Sora was not in the room for Hargrove's statement. She was at the nurse's station, where she belonged, doing the documentation she had not finished. But Marcus was near the second-floor landing when Hargrove walked out of the consultation room 40 minutes later, and Marcus said afterward that the man had the expression of someone who had said something important and knew that it had landed, not with drama, not with visible triumph, but with the specific quiet of a person who has done what they came to do and has no need to stand around watching the results. The hearing was postponed indefinitely, not canceled, technically. Postponed pending review of the acquisition consultation documentation and a formal independent assessment of Mateo's behavioral status, ordered by the court liaison on Pryor's recommendation. Voss signed off on the postponement at 3:42. Sora was there when he did it. She was standing at the station, end-of-shift documentation finally complete, jacket on, ready to leave. She watched him sign the form. He set the pen down. He did not look at her. Then he did. "The independent assessment," he said. "Who are you suggesting for the evaluator?" She had been thinking about this since Pryor mentioned it. "Dr. Amara Nkosi," she said. "She's at the University Pediatric Center. Her work on trauma-based elective mutism is the most current in the region. She's not affiliated with Margrave or any referring institution." He wrote down the name. He did not ask how Sora knew it. He did not question the recommendation. "I'll contact her office tomorrow," he said. Sora picked up her bag. "I'll be here at 6:30, she said. "Same as usual." She walked out. In the elevator, she let her shoulders drop 1 inch, and only 1 inch, because there were still cameras, and she was still a professional, and the day was not over. In any sense, that mattered. What she did not know, what none of them knew, not yet, was that the woman from the Margrave Institute had not gone quietly. She had made a phone call from the lobby at 2:17, and the person she had called was not her supervisor at the institute. It was a member of Harlow's administrative board, the same one whose name had appeared in the billing projection. And that person, upon learning that the hearing had been postponed, and that a retired Navy Admiral had given a witness statement, and that the patient safety officer had pulled internal camera audit records, had made their own calls. 3 of them, each one slightly more frantic than the last. By the time Sora reached the ground floor and pushed through the lobby doors into the gray November air of Callaway, the thing she had been holding together with documentation and paracord and 22 minutes of quiet humming every morning was about to get much more complicated. Because the administrative board member's 3rd call had gone to someone with the authority to override Pryor, override Voss, override a court liaison's postponement order, and force the Rio's transfer through emergency administrative channels before an independent evaluator could be appointed, and that person had said yes. She found out at 6:48 the next morning, not from an official communication, not from Voss or Pryor or Sitch. She found out because Marcus was waiting outside the staff entrance when she arrived, standing in the cold with his jacket zipped to the collar and his phone in his hand, and his expression was the one she had learned to read as, "Something has already happened and I couldn't stop it." "They filed an emergency administrative transfer order last night," he said, "after you left. Board-level authorization. It bypasses the court liaison postponement because it's classified as a patient safety action rather than a transfer recommendation." Sora stopped walking. "They're reframing Tuesday's incident," Marcus continued. "The maintenance landing. They're calling it a critical elopement event attributable to inadequate therapeutic containment. The new documentation classifies Mateo as a flight risk patient requiring immediate placement in a secured residential facility." He paused. The order was signed at 9:47 p.m. by a board member named Aldrich Boone. She stood on the sidewalk in the gray morning and breathed the cold air in through her nose. Aldrich Boone. She had seen the name once, on the framed donor wall in the hospital lobby, third column from the left, mid-tier contribution level, the kind of name that existed in the background of institutions until it didn't. "Who authorized the patient safety reclassification?" she asked. Boone countersigned with Dr. Voss. She looked at Marcus. He looked back. "I know," he said. She went inside. Voss was in his office when she arrived at the unit. The glass wall had its blinds angled but not closed, which she read as either carelessness or a statement, and she had been around long enough to assume the latter. She did not go to his office. She went to the nurse's station, signed in, pulled up the administrative record, and read the transfer order herself. It was clean. Technically clean, in the way that things drafted by someone who has done this before are technically clean. The language chosen carefully enough that every individual sentence was defensible. But the structure of it, the sequence of the logic, the specific reclassification of Tuesday's incident from voluntary patient movement to elopement event, that was a rewrite, not an interpretation. A rewrite of documented facts using different vocabulary to produce a different legal category. She printed it. She placed it in her folder alongside the incident report she had filed, in which the same event was documented with timestamps and behavioral observations that supported the exact opposite conclusion. 2 documents about the same morning, 2 completely different children. Felicity arrived at 7:10 and took one look at the station and at Sora and did not say good morning. She sat down, pulled up her patient list, and started working. That was the right call. Sora noted it. Tomas arrived at 7:20 with coffee for 2 and set 1 cup beside Sora without comment. Also the right call. At 7:45, Sora called Hargrove. He picked up on the second ring, which meant he was awake and had been awake for some time, which meant he had either anticipated this or been informed already through a channel she didn't know about. Possibly both. "Boone," she said. "I know." His voice was flat and awake. "I heard at 6:15. "How?" "Pryor called me. She's not happy." "What can she do?" Patient safety officers can flag administrative decisions for external review. It doesn't have the force of law, but it creates a paper trail that legal departments hate. A pause. But the board authorization gives them a 24-hour execution window on the transfer. They can move Mateo before an external review is completed. Sora looked at the clock on the station wall. 7:48, 24 hours from 9:47 the previous night. "That's 2 o'clock this afternoon," she said. "Yes." She did the math without wanting to. It came out the same either way. "What we need," she said, keeping her voice below the station noise, "is something that makes the reclassification itself untenable, not the transfer recommendation, the specific document Voss countersigned. You'd need to demonstrate that the reclassification was made without clinical basis. I have documentation that contradicts it. You need someone who can make that documentation matter in the next 6 hours." A pause. "Pryor is filing the flag. That's something. But you need the independent clinical voice, Nkosi." Dr. Amara Nkosi, the evaluator Sora had recommended the previous afternoon, who Voss had agreed to contact tomorrow, which was now today, which was a window that was closing fast. "Voss said he'd contact her office today," Sora said. "He won't, not now. not after countersigning the order. She already knew that. She had known it when she said it. She was testing whether he would say the same thing, which he had, which confirmed she wasn't reading the situation wrong. "Can you reach her?" she asked. A silence. "I can make a call," he said. "I can't make her come. She's an independent clinician, not under my authority." "Tell her what I have," Sora said. "Tell her the timeline. If she looks at the documentation and agrees the reclassification is clinically unsupported, then she can file her own professional objection," he finished, "which carries independent weight separate from Pryor's administrative flag." A pause. "That's two simultaneous challenges to the order. Legal would need to address both before proceeding." "Make the call," Sora said. She hung up. "What?" She told Rosa at 8:15. She didn't soften it. Rosa had not asked her to soften things, and doing so would have been a kind of disrespect that neither of them had time for. She laid out the timeline plainly. Order signed, execution window, 2 o'clock, and watched Rosa's face do what it did when she was processing something difficult, which was go very still and very inward, the same way her grandson went still. And Sora understood again how that stillness got built, what kind of history turned stillness into a survival tool in a family. "Can they do this legally?" Rosa asked. "They can attempt it. The question is whether they can do it before the challenges hold." Rosa looked at her hands. "If they take him today? If they put him on a transport at 2 o'clock? He'll regress," Sora said, "significantly. What's been built over 4 weeks will not survive a forced environmental change at this stage." "That's not an opinion. That's what the research says." Rosa was quiet. "I need you to do something," Sora said. "I need you to call Miss Ortega, the court liaison. Tell her about the reclassification and tell her your understanding is that the postponement order she issued has been effectively circumvented by a board action filed hours after her ruling. She needs to hear that from the family, not from me." Rosa looked up. Her eyes were dry and direct. "You can't call her yourself." "I'm a hospital employee. There are limits on what that looks like." Rosa reached into her coat pocket for her phone. "What's her number?" Sora had written it on a piece of paper that morning. She slid it across the table. Rosa picked it up, looked at it, and stood. "I'll call from the hallway," she said. "Give me 10 minutes." She was back in 8. "She wants the order documentation," Rosa said. "Fax to her office in the next hour." "I'll handle it." Rosa sat back down. She put her hands flat on the table the way people put their hands flat on tables when they are deciding to hold their ground. "Sora," she said, "is this going to work?" Sora looked at her. She thought about what honesty required in this moment, which was not reassurance and not pessimism, but the specific thing that was actually true. "I don't know," she said, "but the order has problems, real ones, and we have 6 hours." Rosa nodded once. "Then we use them." The next 4 hours moved the way urgent things move in institutions. Not fast in any cinematic sense, but dense. Each minute carrying more load than minutes usually carry. The pressure building through paperwork and phone calls and people appearing in doorways with expressions that communicated everything except calm. Sora faxed the transfer order documentation to Ortega's office at 8:57. Marcus, without being asked, pulled the full administrative record of Boone's board activity over the past 18 months and found that he had also been the countersigning authority on 2 previous Harlow patient transfers to the Margrave Institute over the past 3 years. Both cases involving children under 10. Both cases where the referring physician had been Voss. He brought this to Pryor at 9:30. Pryor read it twice. She did not speak for approximately 40 seconds. Then she made a phone call that Marcus could hear from the hallway, in a tone that her staff had likely not heard before. At 10:12, Hargrove texted Sora 2 words, "Nkosi coming." She read it at the station. She read it twice to make sure she had read it correctly. Then she put her phone in her pocket and went to check on Mateo because that was what the next 10 minutes were actually for, regardless of everything else. He was on the edge of his bed with the Navy cord. He had made something. Not a standard knot, something he had constructed on his own, a loose symmetrical pattern that he had clearly been working on for a while. He held it up when she came in, not to show it off, just to show her. The way you show someone a thing you made when you want them to see it before anyone else. She looked at it. It was a mess, technically. Asymmetric, one loop tighter than the others, a false cross in the middle that would make it impossible to untangle cleanly. It was also completely his. "That's new," she said. He nodded. He set it in his lap and went back to adjusting one of the loops. She sat down. She stayed for 11 minutes. She did not tell him anything about what was happening outside this room because he didn't need to carry that, and because this room was still what it had been, consistent, arranged the same way, cord and stone and crane, the triangle intact. And she was going to keep it that way for as long as she could. When she left, she paused at the door. He was still working the loop, tongue to lower lip, concentrated. She pulled the door shut behind her and went back to the work. Dr. Amara Nkosi arrived at 11:40. She was 47, brisk, with reading glasses she wore on her face, instead of on a chain and a bag over her shoulder that was clearly heavy with materials she had brought from her own office. She had driven from the university in under 2 hours, which was not nothing. She introduced herself to Pryor first, then to Sora. She shook Sora's hand and looked at her with the specific directness of someone who has been briefed and is now doing their own calibration independent of the briefing. "I've read your incident report," she said, "and the reclassification document." She paused. "They're describing the same event in two completely different clinical languages." "Yes," Sora said. "Walk me through the behavioral progression from day one." She was already reaching into her bag. "Everything you observed. I want dates, I want specifics, and I want the objects." Sora walked her through it, all of it. 40 minutes, no omissions, the same clinical specificity she had used in the review meeting, but this time with someone across the table who was following every sentence with the attention of a person who knew exactly what she was hearing and what it meant. When Sora finished, Nkosi looked at her notes for a moment. "The reclassification document calls Tuesday's event a flight risk elopement," she said. "A flight risk elopement is defined under the Behavioral Health Administrative Code as an involuntary, distress-driven departure from secured care." She looked up. "What you've described is the opposite. A child in early re-engagement phase who demonstrated purposeful, organized, self-directed movement to a location associated with paternal memory, water proximity, elevated vantage, and who waited rather than fled. That's not elopement. That's not even close." "No," Sora said, and he spoke. 3 words. Nkosi set down her pen. "To a person he had chosen to trust." She was quiet for a moment. "The reclassification of that event as evidence of clinical deterioration is not a difference of interpretation. It is factually incorrect." The room was very still. "I'll file a formal clinical objection," Nkosi said, "within the hour. It will go to the court liaison and to the State Pediatric Behavioral Health Oversight Board." She paused. "That's 2 independent objections to the order, administrative and clinical. Together with the court liaison's inquiry, you have 3 separate challenges active simultaneously before the execution window." Pryor, who had been sitting at the end of the table, said quietly, "Legal will need to address all 3 before they can move forward." "Which takes longer than 2 hours," Sora said. "Considerably," Nkosi said. She picked up her pen. "Let me start writing." At 12:51, 49 minutes before the execution window, Sitch appeared on the 4th floor. He was not at his most composed. He had the look of a man who had spent the morning being handed documents that changed the shape of the problem he had been managing, and who had run out of ways to hold the shape stable. He asked to speak to Sora, and they went to the consultation room on 2, the same one where she had stood with Hargrove that morning. "The board authorization," he said without preamble. "Boone's countersignature. There's a problem with it." She waited. "The patient safety reclassification requires a concurrent clinical signatory at the attending level or above." He set a paper on the table. Voss's countersignature was submitted as clinical authorization. But Voss was formally listed as recommending physician on the original transfer referral. Under the hospital's own administrative code, a recommending physician cannot serve as clinical authority on a subsequent reclassification of the same patient because of the inherent conflict of interest. He paused. "That's not my interpretation. That's the code." Sora looked at the paper. "Who caught that?" "Pryor." A beat. "She went through the code line by line this morning." Pryor. Methodical, unglamorous, patient safety officer, Pryor, who had arrived at that review meeting with a stack of files and had been taking notes. "Which means," Sora said carefully, "the reclassification document is procedurally invalid regardless of the clinical objections." "Yes." "And the board authorization based on an invalid reclassification cannot be executed," Sitch said. He did not look happy about it, which she understood. He was legal. He did not enjoy having to go back to a board member and explain that the document they had rushed through at 10 o'clock the previous night had a procedural defect that a careful reading of the hospital's own code made obvious. That was not a comfortable conversation. "I need to inform Boone and Voss," he said. "I wanted you to know first." She looked at him. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because you're the only person in this building who has been consistently right about this patient," he said. It came out flatly, not graciously, more like something he had decided to say because it was accurate, and accuracy was the only currency that was going to be worth anything in the next few hours. "And because I would rather tell you before you hear it from someone who will make it sound like a close call." He picked up the paper and left. Sora sat in the consultation room for a moment by herself. She pressed both palms flat on the table and breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth, 4 counts each. The same pattern she had used in places where the air had other things in it besides cold and the smell of floor cleaner. And she thought about a 7-year-old boy on a concrete landing holding a railing with both hands and choosing, eventually, to let go. Then she stood up and went back upstairs. The afternoon moved quickly after that, the way afternoons move when an institutional crisis resolves. Not with announcement, not with visible ceremony, but in the sudden depressurization of a space that had been holding too much for too long. Phones that had been ringing with urgency went quiet. Doorways that had been occupied cleared. Voss was in his office with the blinds fully closed at 2:15. Sora knew because she walked past and the light under the door was on, and no one was going in or out. Boone's name appeared in her awareness at 2:40, when Marcus passed her in the hallway with a brief, low-voiced report. Boone had arrived at the hospital at 2:30 for what he had apparently believed would be a routine confirmation of the transfer execution. Instead, he had been directed by Sitch to a closed meeting with Pryor, the medical director, a man named Dr. Hugh Farrar, who had been largely absent from this situation until the past 2 hours, and a state oversight board representative who had driven in after receiving Nkosi's filed objection. She did not know what was said in that meeting. She would not know for several days. What she knew by 4 o'clock was that the transfer order had been formally withdrawn. Not postponed. Withdrawn. She knew because Pryor appeared at the nurse's station at 4:03 with the precise, careful expression of someone delivering information they have earned the right to deliver, and said to Sora directly, "The transfer order for Mateo Rios has been rescinded. Dr. Nkosi will conduct her independent evaluation beginning tomorrow morning. Mateo remains in current care pending her assessment." The station was not quiet. It was never quiet at 4 o'clock. But the nurses who were there heard it, and there was a moment, brief, human, not performed, where the air in the room changed in a way that everyone felt and nobody named. Felicity turned back to her computer. Her jaw was doing something she was controlling. Tomas was at the far end of the station, and he put both hands flat on the counter and looked at them. Marcus, behind Sora's left shoulder, exhaled one breath through his nose that said everything it needed to say in the length of time it took. Sora said, "Thank you, Dr. Pryor." Pryor nodded and walked back toward her office. Sora finished the notation she had been writing. She picked up her folder. She went to room 9. Mateo was asleep. It was the early evening drowse that children fell into sometimes when the day had been, in whatever way they experienced it, more than usual. Not distressed, just spent. The Navy cord was on the pillow. The messy, asymmetric, entirely his knot structure sat beside it, untouched since morning. She looked at it. The asymmetry. The false cross. The one loop that was tighter than it should be. She thought, he made something imperfect and kept it. Didn't undo it, didn't ask her to fix it, just put it down and left it there as a thing that existed in his space. That was something. That was actually everything. She reached into her pocket and placed a new cord on the window ledge, a longer one, a deep red, not knotted yet, for tomorrow. She left. In the parking structure at 4:47, she sat in her car for a moment with her keys in her hand and did not immediately start the engine. The afternoon light was already going, the way November light went in Callaway, fast and without ceremony, the lake horizon swallowing it before the city was ready. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. It was not Hargrove. It was not Rosa. It was an email from an address she did not recognize, a domain she did not recognize, with a subject line that contained only a case number. A case number she recognized immediately. Not Mateo's case number. A different one. Older. From a proceeding she had believed was closed 4 years ago, sealed under the terms of a confidentiality agreement she had signed during her medical discharge review. Her discharge review. From the Navy. The one in which certain events during her second deployment had been recorded, reviewed, and formally classified at a level that should have meant that no one outside a specific clearance threshold could access them. She looked at the email for a long time without opening it. Then she looked at the sender address again. Slow. Careful. It was not from a legal office. It was not from the Navy. It was not from anyone with an obvious institutional affiliation. But the domain, the last 4 characters of the domain, matched a naming convention she had last seen on internal communications from the Margrave Institute's parent organization. Not the institute itself. The parent. The larger network of residential behavioral facilities, of which Margrave was one of 7 properties across 3 states. Someone in that network had her discharge file. Her sealed, classified discharge file. And they had just let her know it. She sat with the phone in her hand for 4 minutes and 17 seconds. She knew it was that long because the parking structure's overhead light cycled on an automated timer, and it clicked on partway through, and she had noted the click. The way she noted most things, involuntarily, automatically, the part of her that had been trained to track environmental changes, doing its work without being asked. The email was still open, the case number still sitting there in the subject line like something that had been waiting for the right moment to surface. She thought about what it meant that someone had sent this now. Not during the hearing, not when the transfer order was active. After. After the order had been rescinded, after Boone's meeting with the Oversight Board representative, after the immediate crisis had been, by every visible measure, resolved. It wasn't a threat issued from a position of power. It was a threat issued from a position of damage control. Someone who had just lost the institutional fight and was looking for a different kind of leverage. Not to stop her, to compromise her, to make the question about her history rather than about their conduct. She understood that calculation because she had seen it before, in contexts that made this one look minor. The move from direct force to exposure was what happened when direct force failed. It was a retreat dressed as an attack. She closed the email without responding. She called Hargrove. He picked up on the first ring this time. "They have my discharge file," she said, "or something that looks like it. They sent a case number to my personal email, parent organization of the Margrave network." A silence. Not surprised silence. Processing silence. "When?" he asked. 20 minutes ago. After the order was pulled. "Yes." He was quiet for another moment. "How much do they have?" "I don't know yet. The case number is correct. That means they have access to at least the file index." She paused. "Thomas, if they release the classification records publicly, even selectively, it creates a question about who I am and why I'm here that I don't have an institutional platform to answer." "You have me," he said. "You're retired." "I'm retired with a specific set of contacts and 18 months of documented anger about how that discharge review was conducted." His voice was even, but there was something underneath it that was not calm. "I let it go because you asked me to. I won't let it go if they move first." She pressed the heel of her hand against the steering wheel. "I'm not asking you to go to war for me, Thomas. I know you're not. That's why I'm offering." A beat. "Send me the email. Don't respond to it yourself, and go home. Sleep. Whatever they're planning, they won't move tonight. They'll wait to see if the board hearing produces enough fallout to make the exposure unnecessary. And if it doesn't, then we answer it," he said, "together, on our terms." She sat with that for a moment. Then she forwarded the email, said goodnight, and started the car. She did not sleep well. She slept. The board meeting about Aldrich Boone took place 9 days later. Not because the institution moved slowly, but because the oversight process required documentation, and the documentation required time. And time was the thing that institutional processes used as both protection and weapon. And Sora had learned years ago that the difference between those two uses was usually who was waiting on which side of it. She was at work every day during those 9 days. She arrived at 6:30. She went to room 9 first. She sat with Mateo, and she brought new chords, and she watched him work through them with increasing speed and confidence and occasional fury. He was not a patient child, it turned out, with things that didn't immediately make sense to him. and he had developed a very specific sound he made when a knot defeated him, a sharp exhale through his nose that was so completely his father's expression, according to Rosa, that the first time Rosa heard it, she had to leave the room for a few minutes. He was becoming someone, not a patient, a person, specific and inconvenient and occasionally loud about the things that frustrated him, which was exactly right, exactly what a 7-year-old was supposed to be. He said Sora's name for the first time on the 4th day. Not to address her. He said it to Rosa, pointing at the door when Sora was 5 minutes late. A statement of fact. Sora's not here yet. Rosa had reported it to her in the hallway afterward, with the expression of someone delivering news they have been wanting to deliver for a long time. Sora had nodded. She had turned and looked at the wall of the corridor for a moment. Then she had turned back and said, "I'll be on time tomorrow," and gone to get his breakfast tray. Doctor. Nkosi's independent evaluation took 3 sessions over 5 days. Her report, submitted to the court liaison and the oversight board on day 6, was 22 pages. Sora did not read it until Nkosi sent her a copy with a brief note that said, "You should see this." The note was 2 lines. The report was thorough enough that Sora read it twice, slowly, and found 3 places where Nkosi's clinical language articulated things that Sora had known were true, but had not had the vocabulary to put into a form that the institution could receive. That was the thing about working outside your official lane for long enough. You stopped speaking the language the building understood. Nkosi had translated it back. The report's conclusion was unambiguous. Mateo Rios was in active and measurable early-stage recovery from trauma-based selective mutism. The primary therapeutic relationship driving this recovery was with his assigned nurse. Disruption of this relationship at the current stage carried a documented clinical risk of 12 to 24 months of regression. Transfer was contraindicated. Continuation of current therapeutic approach was strongly recommended, with the addition of weekly sessions with a trauma-specialized child psychologist in a supporting rather than primary role. She filed it. The court liaison accepted it. The proceeding was formally closed. The board meeting happened on a Tuesday. Sora was not invited and did not attend. She was at work, on the floor, doing her job, which was the only appropriate place for her to be. She knew the meeting was happening because Patricia had mentioned it in passing. The careful way Patricia mentioned things she was aware were significant, but did not want to over-signal. What she learned afterward came in pieces over the following 48 hours, some from Marcus, some from Pryor. One piece from Sitch, who stopped by the station on Wednesday afternoon and stood there for a moment with his hands in his jacket pockets and the look of a man who had watched something arrive that he had been hoping would arrive but had not been certain would. Aldrich Boone was removed from the Harlow Children's Medical Center Board of Directors at the Tuesday meeting by a vote of 7-2. The grounds included undisclosed financial interests in the Margrave Parent Organization, a stake that predated his board appointment at Harlow by 3 years and had never been declared in his annual conflict of interest filing. The relationship between his board position, his countersignature authority on patient transfer orders, and the financial benefit his organization received from each transferred placement had been documented by the State Oversight Board's investigator with the particular thoroughness that oversight boards deploy when they believe something has been going on for longer than the immediate case suggests. Because it had. The 2 previous Harlow to Margrave transfers, the ones Marcus had identified from the administrative records, were now under review. Both families had been contacted. Boone did not resign before the vote. He had believed, apparently, that 7 votes against him was not achievable, which said something about how long he had operated in environments that confirmed his assumptions, and how poorly that prepared a person for the moment when the assumptions stopped holding. Dr. Raymond Voss was placed on administrative review pending an investigation into his role in the reclassification document. This was not a termination, and it was not a censure. Not yet. It was the beginning of a process that would take several more months and would ultimately result in outcomes that Sora would hear about secondhand by then, because she would no longer be primarily concerned with what happened to Raymond Voss. What she observed directly, in the days after the board meeting, was that Voss came to work and did his job and moved through the ward with the particular subdued quality of someone who has recently discovered that the structure they had been standing on was less solid than they believed. He was not cruel in his diminishment. He was quieter. He stopped using the word measurable as a cudgel. He started reading the observation notes more carefully before forming opinions. He was not transformed, People don't transform. But he was, in the specific and limited way that matters, different. She did not forgive him. She also did not think about him very much. There were better things to think about. The email from the Margrave Parent Organization was never followed up. She did not know exactly why, and she had made a deliberate decision not to spend energy trying to find out. Hargrove had made calls. He had been, she gathered, very specific about what the exposure of a classified Navy file, obtained through means that would themselves require explanation, would look like when examined by people with the relevant clearances and the relevant motivations. Whatever he had said, and to whom, had produced a result. The domain disappeared from her spam filter. The case number was never mentioned again. She had one more conversation with Hargrove about it, 2 weeks after the board meeting, on the phone at 9 in the evening. "It's done," he said. "Is it done cleanly?" "Clean enough. The parent organization is under its own scrutiny from the state review. They don't have appetite for additional exposure right now." She looked out her apartment window. The lake was visible on clear nights from her building's east side, a dark shape against the darker sky. "Thomas, what did you tell them?" A pause. "I told them what I should have said publicly 4 years ago and chose not to, because you asked me to, and because I thought you deserved the privacy." He paused again. "I told them what you did. Specifically. The cases, the outcomes, the circumstances." A beat. "I told them that if they published a single line from that file, they would not be the only ones publishing." She was quiet. "You have a record, Sora. A real one. You just never used it." "I didn't want to use it." "I know." His voice was not impatient with her, just clear. "But it exists. And the people who tried to use your history against you did not understand that your history is not the vulnerability they thought it was." She thought about that for a while after they hung up. She thought about the difference between the past as a wound and the past as a foundation. About how long she had been treating hers as the former when it had always been the latter. About a 7-year-old who sat on a concrete landing with water below him and chose not to fall, which was not the same as not being afraid, which was never the same as not being afraid. Matteo spoke his first full sentence to Sora on a Thursday morning, 6 weeks after she had been assigned to room 9. It was not a dramatic moment, which was appropriate because the real moments rarely are. He had been working a new chord, a longer and more complex sequence she had introduced the previous week, and he had gotten 3/4 through it before losing the structure entirely, and he had set it down and looked at her with the now familiar exhale of frustration. She had waited. He had picked it back up. He had tried again. He had made it 4 steps further before it collapsed again in his hands, and then he had looked at her with an expression that was not defeat. It was not defeat, she was certain. She had seen defeat, and this was not it. And he had said, in a voice that was still rough at the edges, but present, fully present, "Can you show me the part I keep missing?" Not a question exactly, more like a statement of need, offered to someone he had decided was safe to need things from. She leaned forward. She took the cord. She showed him. He watched. He tried. He got it right. He didn't say anything else that session. She didn't need him to. By the time Matteo was discharged from Harlow Children's Medical Center, 3 months after Sora had first walked into room 9 with a breakfast tray she knew he wouldn't touch, he was speaking in full sentences to anyone who made the effort to approach him the way Sora had taught the staff, slowly, without performance, without demand. He was not talkative. He might never be the loud, constant child his kindergarten teacher had described. The water had changed something in him, the way certain experiences change something, the way you can't unknow the weight of an absence or the feeling of cold that goes below the skin. But he was present, entirely, imperfectly, specifically present. Rosa came to collect him on a Wednesday morning. She brought food for the nursing staff, a situation that produced mild chaos at the station because it was good food, genuinely good, and nobody had eaten breakfast yet, and Felicity cried a little into a tamale, which she later denied. Matteo walked out of room 9 under his own power in his own clothes with a paracord bracelet on his right wrist, navy blue, the color of the first cord he had worked through entirely on his own, and an origami crane in the pocket of his jacket. He stopped at the nurse's station. He looked at Tomas, who had brought him coffee he didn't drink, and who had stood quietly at the edge of enough moments that he had become part of the landscape of Matteo's recovery without either of them making a point of it. Mateo looked at him for a moment and then raised one hand in a small, deliberate wave. Tomas put his fist over his mouth and looked at the ceiling. He looked at Marcus, who looked back at him with the particular expression of a person trying very hard to be professionally composed and failing in a way that was completely respectable. "Take care of yourself, kid," Marcus said. Mateo nodded once, serious, like a promise. Then he looked at Sora. She was standing at the end of the station. She had not positioned herself in the middle of the departure because this was his moment, not hers, and she knew the difference even when it cost her something to maintain it. He crossed to her. He held up his right wrist. The bracelet. He had worked it himself over 3 sessions, imperfect in places, one loop slightly looser than the others, a characteristic irregularity that made it entirely his. "I did the tension part right," he said. "You did," she said. He looked at her for a moment. He was 7 years old, and he had been in water that took his father, and he had gone silent for 2 months, and he had come back through a series of small decisions that nobody had required him to make, only made possible by keeping the space consistent and the triangle intact and the cord available and the time unhurried. He put his arms around her waist and held on for approximately 8 seconds. She held on back. She did not count the seconds while it was happening. She only knew the number later, approximately, because she was the kind of person who tracked things, and because she wanted to remember it with some precision, and because 8 seconds was longer than it sounds, when you have spent 2 months sitting 2 feet away from someone waiting for them to decide you were safe. He let go. He went back to Rosa. He took his grandmother's hand. They walked out. Sora watched them go. She watched until the elevator doors closed, and then she stood at the window that faced the east side of the building and watched the parking structure and the strip of sky above it, and the pale, flat November light coming off Lake Carver in the distance. And she did not try to manage what her face was doing because there was nobody looking. After a while, Felicity appeared beside her with a cup of coffee. Not the 11 o'clock pot, fresh. She didn't say anything. She just handed it over and stood there for a minute. "Thank you," Sora said. "Don't," Felicity said. "Not unkindly, just don't make it something we have to talk about." Sora understood that completely. 2 weeks after Mateo's discharge, Dr. Voss requested a meeting with Sora. Not a disciplinary meeting, not a review. A meeting in his office with the door open and 2 cups of coffee on the desk, both of which had been made by him personally, which she knew because she arrived early and saw him at the machine. He sat down. He looked at the desk for a moment before he looked at her. "I want to talk about the new program," he said. Harlow had announced, in the wake of the board restructuring and the oversight review, a redesign of its pediatric trauma recovery protocol. Pryor had pushed for it. The medical director, Farrar, had approved it. It was going to require a clinical lead. "You built something in room 9, Voss said. Without authorization, without institutional support, against active resistance from my office." He stopped. "I'm not going to characterize that as an asset of my department. I'm going to characterize it as something you did that I failed to see the value of, and that I actively worked against, and that worked anyway." He paused. "The new program needs someone who already knows what it looks like when it works." She looked at him. "You're offering me the clinical lead position. I'm asking if you'd consider it." She thought about that. She thought about the specific costs of what the past several months had taken, the early mornings and the incident reports and the review meetings and the parking structure at 4:47 in the afternoon with an email open on her phone that someone had sent to make her feel like she had something to lose. She thought about Nkosi's 22 pages, about Marcus pulling administrative records at 6 in the morning because something wasn't right, and he had decided on his own that mattered, about Thomas and his fist over his mouth. About 8 seconds. "I'll need full clinical authority over methodology," she said. "No transfer recommendations overriding active therapeutic engagement without independent evaluation. No board members with undisclosed interests in receiving facilities anywhere near case decisions." "Agreed. And I want Marcus on the team, formally. His observational work on Mateo's case was as clinically significant as anything I produced." Voss looked at her. "He's an orderly." "He's going to apply to nursing school in the spring," she said. "He told me last week. Until then, he's the most perceptive person on this floor, and I want him credited accordingly." A pause. "I'll talk to HR about a formal patient observation specialist designation," he said. "It'll take some paperwork." "Most things worth doing do," she said. He almost smiled. It was small and brief and cost him something to produce, but it was there. Will you take it? She thought about room 9, about the window ledge and the triangle and a stone moved 3 inches in the night, about all the rooms she had worked in before this one, in conditions no one at this station would ever need to know about, where she had learned that the thing keeping a person tethered to the world was rarely the thing anyone expected, rarely loud, rarely visible, almost always small. Yes, she said. The program launched 4 months later under the name the staff had taken to calling it informally, long before anyone had named it officially, the Triangle Protocol. The name came from Marcus, who had mentioned it once in passing, not intending to name anything, just describing what he had observed in room 9. Stone, cord, crane, a triangle of consistent objects in a consistent space, and the name had stuck the way accurate names stick. Sora ran the clinical lead from the 4th floor. Nkosi came on as consulting specialist, 2 days a month. Her schedule brutal and her presence worth every logistical difficulty it created. The child psychologist assigned to the supporting role was a young man named Dr. Perry Aldana, who was 29 years old, recently out of his residency, and who had the uncommon quality of being willing to be taught by people he had not expected to learn from. He learned fast. The first cohort of Triangle Protocol patients was 6 children, ages 4 to 11, 3 cases of trauma-based selective mutism, 1 of acute dissociative withdrawal, 1 of post-event sensory processing disorder, 1 that Sora privately classified as the kind of thing that doesn't have a clean name yet, but we know it when we see it. All of them had been through the standard protocol. None of them had substantially progressed. She assigned each of them a primary nurse who had been through the triangle training she had designed herself over 6 weeks of early mornings and several arguments with Voss about methodology that they had both survived and that had, in the surviving, improved the methodology. She did not take a primary assignment herself. That was not what a clinical lead did. But she moved through those rooms the way she moved through everything, unhurried, calibrated, watching for the small things that the large frameworks missed. A stone moved in the night. A cord picked up for the first time. A shoulder that dropped 1 degree. A child who turned fractionally toward the light. She wrote it all down. Not because she needed the notes, because it mattered that it existed in a form other than memory, because the things that happened in these rooms deserved the dignity of being recorded, because someday someone was going to read these files and know what to look for. On a Friday afternoon in late spring, Sora received a photograph. Not a medical document, a personal photo sent by Rosa to her cell phone, with a message that said only, "Thought you should see." It was a picture of Mateo, outdoors, somewhere with a dock and open water behind him, Lake Carver from the look of it, or somewhere like it. He was standing on the dock with his legs apart and his arms slightly out for balance the way children stand on docks, and he was looking at the water. Not at the camera, at the water. He was not afraid. She could see that in the line of his shoulders, in the way his feet were planted. Not braced, balanced. He was looking at the water the way you look at something you have decided to understand rather than survive. He had a paracord bracelet on his right wrist. Navy blue. She looked at the photograph for a long time. She thought about what it cost to go still, and what it cost to come back from still, and how the 2 costs are completely different, and both of them are real. She thought about the space between silence and sound, which is where she had spent most of her professional life working. Not in the silence, not in the sound, but in the space between, which is where the decision happens, where the person decides whether the world is safe enough to re-enter. She thought about what it had taken to hold that space open, the documented, undramatic daily labor of it, the objects placed without explanation. The chair pulled 2 feet from the edge of someone's withdrawal and held there, session after session, without demand. She thought about the fact that none of it was visible, that if you hadn't been watching carefully, if you hadn't learned what small looked like, you would have seen nothing happening in room 9 for 6 weeks. You would have seen a nurse sitting with a child who wasn't responding, and you would have concluded what everyone concluded, that nothing was happening, that the effort was wasted, that the resource should be redirected toward something with measurable output. And you would have been wrong. You would have been wrong because progress in a human being does not always produce a visible signal, because the most important thing that happens between a person who is broken and a person who is beginning to mend is often 3 inches. A stone moved. A shoulder that drops 1 degree. A child who turns for the first time toward the light. Those things are not nothing. They are everything. They are the whole work, contained in the smallest possible gesture, and the only way to see them is to stay. She typed back to Rosa. He looks like himself. 3 minutes later, Rosa replied with a single line. He said his father would have liked you. He told me to tell you that. Sora set her phone down on the desk in the office that had her name on the door now, the plain placard that had been installed on a Thursday morning by a facilities staffer who had done it without ceremony. She looked at the window. Outside, the lake was doing what the lake always did in late spring, catching the afternoon light and throwing it back in pieces, broken and bright and vast. A person could look at it and see the thing that took, or they could look at it and see the thing that remained. She had been choosing, one morning at a time, for a long time now, to see the thing that remained. She picked up the cord on her desk, navy blue, waiting for the next session, not yet knotted, and her fingers moved through the first sequence from memory, sure and unhurried, building something small and strong and meant to be worked loose by someone who needed the practice of undoing things gently. That was the work. It had always been the work. Not the recognition, not the record, not the room with her name on the door, the cord in her hands, the child across from her. The space between them held open, carefully, for as long as it took. Some people stay when staying is the hardest thing in the room. They don't announce it, they don't perform it, they just come back the next day and sit down and begin again. That is not a small thing. It has never been a small thing. It is, in fact, the whole of it,